few minutes past 12, so we'll go ahead and begin. Good morning, everyone. My name is Santasuk Austin Psychosi, and I am the media editor for the SAIS Review. Let me begin by saying it's a pleasure to have you all here to be here for the launch event for the SAIS Review Spring 2024 edition. SAIS Review dates back to 1956, when at the time, it was simply an alumni letter. You could buy a subscription to the SAIS Review for $1 per year, or you can buy a single copy for 35 cents. In 1981, it became a full-fledged student academic journal. And today we continue the legacy of providing fresh and policy-relevant perspectives to political, economic, and security questions in our world. The title for our Spring 2024 edition is After the Dust Settles, and it analyzes international cooperation following disruptive economic, climate, health, political, and military events. Our distinguished panelists today are Gavin Wilde, a senior fellow in the a senior fellow in the Technology and International Affairs program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, who also happens to be a professor here at SAIS, and Taylor Grossman, who is the Deputy Director for Digital Security at the Institute for Security and Technology. We're glad to have them here and to have them talk about their expertise on technology and cybersecurity. I want to end my remarks by extending thanks to all the individuals who have helped create the journal we have here today. Thank you to all the authors who have contributed to the spring edition. Thank you to all the assistant editors who worked tirelessly editing the drafts. Thank you to the Foreign Policy Institute for all their support. Thank you to the advisory board for providing us guidance when we needed it. And finally, thank you to Ambassador Cinnamon Dornside, who is our faculty advisor. Before passing the mic on to Ambassador Dornside, I would like to announce the next editorial board for the academic year. We have Ju-Won Lin as the new podcast editor. We have Suk Jun Yoon as the media editor, Anthony DeLuca Barada as the managing editor, Daniel Sixto as the senior editor, and Akrif Arikumar as the editor-in-chief. If you are part of that next academic year editorial team, could you please stand up so we can congratulate you? Thank you. And finally, I will pass the mic on to Ambassador Cinnamon Dornside, who is not only our faculty advisor, but also the executive director at the Foreign Policy Institute. Ambassador Dornside, would you please come up? Sure.
So thank you, Austin. Can people hear me, or shall I use a mic? People can hear me? All right, very good. So as Austin mentioned, the SAIS Review is published by the Johns Hopkins University Press, and it is a leading academic journal in international policy. It is led and managed by a competitively selected team of students comprised of current SAIS students, and they are advised by an advisory board, which is chaired by our dean, who will be joining us very shortly, and also a distinguished board of other experts, including faculty and others outside of SAIS, but who provide those perspectives that will give insights into the topic that is being studied. They publish scholarly essays that link practical experience with inquiry in the search for bringing a fresh look at policy-oriented global, political, economic, and security questions such as we have today. So contributors have included a wide range of backgrounds, including academics, policy analysts, journalists, senior officials from both government and non-governmental organizations. And the winter-spring 2024 issue, which is going to be on After the Dust Settles, How the World Rebuilds After Crisis, is an excellent example of this kind of approach. So I would like to thank very much the 2024 editorial board, Alexandra Huggins, our editor-in-chief, Mira Anderson, who's been our managing editor, Austin Psychose, who's been our online editor, yes, that's correct, and Cozy Obuli, who's our podcast editor, for all of their work, as well as all the assistant editors, some of whom are going to be stepping up to take over for the new editorial team. And so I'd like to maybe pause here and see if there are any questions that anyone have, either about the Foreign Policy Institute or about the SAIS review. So I think we are waiting for our dean to arrive, so I will get up again and introduce him when he arrives, but I'm just very pleased to see all of you here today. Sure, thank you.
At the moment, we're still waiting for the refreshments to come through, but when they do come, they will be sent in the back for you guys to go ahead and grab. But for now, I will pass the mic on to our editor-in-chief and our lovely panelists. Oh.
Hello, everyone. Thank you again for joining us. As Austin mentioned, I'm Alexandra Huggins. I'm the editor-in-chief, and I'll be moderating the panel today. So thank you to our panelists for joining us. As mentioned, Taylor Grossman and Gavin Wilde are contributors to our journal this year, and have written a fantastic article entitled Voluntarism and Cyber Support and Warfare, Pro Bono or Cui Bono. And so we are very excited to hear their perspectives today. So thank you both for joining us. So how we proceed now is here is Dean Steinberg to give a couple of brief comments before we get our discussion started.
Great. Sorry to say, I'm triple booked for this period of time, and just had a wonderful opportunity to introduce the Deputy Executive Director of the MCC, who's talking to another group of students upstairs. But I just want to thank you all for the work that you do SAIS review. And this is really an important part of the life experience that we have here, and helping to produce and engage on the big issues of the day. And I think it's really a reflection of a serious commitment that we have as both faculty and students to, advancing scholarship and bringing these ideas to the public debate. And really grateful to the leadership of the SAIS review and the board and all the advisors and the people who helped make this happen. It really is it's a flagship of what we do here. It's really I think keeps us in the world of ideas as people are debating them now. And there have been so many innovative approaches that we've all taken to sort of thinking about the topics to cover and how to engage important voices. So it's been a privilege for me to be part of that and to work with you in terms of thinking about the content here, and to make this a valuable experience that you can not only contribute through the work that's done, that you publish, but also the experience you have of working with the editors and with the writers and stuff to make this happen. So congratulations on another great issue, and really appreciate the work that you do. And for those of you who are moving on to the next steps of your career, best of luck, and look forward to keeping in touch with all of you. Thanks for doing this.
Thank you, Dean Steinberg. Perfect timing, actually.
Here comes lunch.
Here's lunch. So how we will proceed from now is I have a couple of individual questions for each of you, and then some broader questions about both the content of your article and the broader issue of technological assistance to Ukraine during their war efforts. So Taylor, would you like to introduce yourself, and then Professor Wilde? Sure.
Hello, everyone. Taylor Grossman, Deputy Director for Digital Security at the Institute for Security and Technology. We're a small nonprofit think tank operating on the West Coast and East Coast, looking at emerging technology challenges. I work primarily on cybersecurity and ransomware. So we just had a big event yesterday on the ransomware task force, which has been going on since 2020. Launched its first report in 2021 April, right before the pipeline, so it's had a little bit of traction. I'm very excited to talk about this that I got.
I'm Gavin Wilde. I'm a senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, focused primarily on cyber and information conflict issues, as well as leveraging my background on Russian issues from my time in government. Also currently an adjunct professor here at SAIS in the Alperovich Institute for Cybersecurity Studies, where I teach a course focused on information theory and cybernetics, international order.
Thank you both again for being here with us today. So Taylor, I think I'll start with you. So in your work, you have discussed multinational cyber rapid response teams to respond quickly to cyber attacks, mainly through NATO and through the EU. So can you speak to the effectiveness of these units and their role, if any, in countering Russia and their efforts in Ukraine?
Yes, so I wrote a report on particularly multinational rapid response teams, as you mentioned, and looking at the EU and the NATO teams in particular. What I found is that the teams are not particularly well built to be rapid or responsive, but actually they're best used as a proactive measure, which we actually need a lot of stuff left of the bang. And so in that case, they can be really powerful tools. And NATO actually is standing up the virtual rapid response capability, and they just recently announced it, that I think might be able to be more reactive and actually get in to respond more quickly. But one of the problems that we see, and that I briefly, is that for a lot of these, if you're talking about a government, their systems are built by the private sector in a lot of cases, where private sector contractors are very involved. And so asking a multinational organization to step in and respond immediately to a threat, to an incident that's happened, when they might not actually understand the system to begin with, and you have a lot of different actors having to use trusted information, that can be very tricky. So we've seen a lot more success with individual countries moving in. The US Forward teams have done a lot of work going in, both proactively and also reactively. Australia is setting up teams, and also individual companies, Microsoft, for example. In a lot of cases, they know the systems that they're having to mitigate and repair. And so we'll see. I'm not sitting on the edge of my seat waiting for NATO or the EU to be incredibly reactive, but I think on the proactive side, they can do quite a bit.
Thank you. So, Gavin, the next question is for you. So in both your article for the SAIS Review and your recent piece of Foreign Policy, you speak about the role of Western assistance to Ukraine, particularly in the technological and cybersecurity sectors. So you also argued that the role of technology should not be overestimated in providing aid to Ukraine and contributing to the war effort. So given the likely passing of the US aid bill to Ukraine in hopefully the coming days through the Senate, can you speak to how you would, if it were up to you, how you would best distribute funds and how you would best utilize them in the technology sector to further the war effort in Ukraine?
Yeah, oh wow, that's a great question. I think one of the reasons that there is both need to temper our expectations for what technological support can do and what role technology plays in warfare, but also what it can do to prevent or proactively disrupt or respond to a cyber attack or intrusion is it's very easy to get enchanted with the technological capabilities that we develop, which are indeed breathtaking in a lot of instances, but often that distracts us from a lot of the human element of what it takes to both win a war and fight a war, but also to respond to or to build more resilience into your technological systems to guard against disruption or to recover from that disruption. One of the things that we see an awful lot in the case of the war itself is that both the Ukrainian side and the Russian side are currently having to grapple with the fact that they all have a lot of toys, but personnel, manpower at the front lines, there's only so many military-aged men ready and willing to fight. There's only so much capacity to train them, and there's only so many with the experience and know-how to actually do something in concert with other battalion groups, et cetera, to advance the front lines one way or the other. And so both Russia and Ukraine are having to kind of grapple with those very real and simple and kind of not 21st century at all, but very traditional demands of, do you have enough humans to do this? But that also applies on the technological front. If you're talking about responding to a cyber attack, there's only so many people in government, in industry, that have the, as Taylor points out, the technological know-how, the familiarity with the systems that are being impacted, with the software and hardware upon which those systems are built. And those human beings also have finite capability. One of the things that we've heard from the private sector particularly in regard to Ukraine, is that look, I can give you licenses, I can give you free network defense capabilities, I can supply you with a lot of the technology. What I don't have at ready reserve is personnel that I can deploy to do this very hard, very time consuming, very arduous work. They're going to get burned out. And I don't have enough to replenish them and keep them on a permanent rotation. That's not just a matter of cost in terms of dollars and cents, that's a matter of cost in terms of just human frailty. And that human frailty extends across the technological cyber security boundary all the way into like the very hard nuts and bolts of how you fight and win in a war.
Thank you. I think that's an underestimated issue that I've not heard discussed a lot in the discussions around Ukraine. So for some general questions based on your article. So this issue of the SAIS review centers on how global crises drive changes in the international system and how multilateral efforts to address them are at the forefront of the future building in both warfare and other issues in the international system. So what is the role of military conflict like the war in Ukraine in driving technological change in the cyberspace?
So we actually discussed a little bit of this in my course. Does war give birth to new technology, or does new technology lend itself to war? And the answer is usually yes, a little bit of column A and a little bit of column B. I think particularly in the case of Ukraine, I've been, yes, astonished at the degree to which drone technology and artificial intelligence in targeting and reconnaissance and intelligence collection and kind of the ingenuity of the digital space in Ukraine. But it's also, as impressive as all those feats are, I think Ukraine has demonstrated how you can use a lot of, you can kind of democratize the space, so to speak. They've done a remarkably efficient job of turning their citizens themselves into kind of collectors of battlefield intelligence, using their mobile phones, using what they have on hand. And so there's a sense in Ukraine among citizens that no, perhaps I'm not of an age or of an experience level to go and pick up a gun and fight. But what I can do is see something, say something, and use an app that has been kind of designed for civil services, and instead kind of use that as almost a form of air defense, collective air defense. Ukrainians rather have shown a lot of ingenuity in how to do a lot with a little and work together in a very federated way, rather than in kind of the centralized way that we tend to think about war fighting and command and control in the West. And so, yeah, that's a long-winded answer to your question.
I'll just add on the production efforts, which is a little bit of sidestepping your question of sort of, what drives change. But I think what you do really see during wartime is major changes to the way that technology is used in war and is actually produced for war. So in the paper that we wrote, we looked a lot at World War I and World War II, and I also think you see this in Ukraine as well, right? Just a huge ramping up of efforts and a real shift in where production capacity is going. So in that case, I think you're building a lot of capacity very quickly, and the ramifications of that on future innovations, on sort of the cycle of innovation, can be really interesting.
Thank you. So you mentioned in your answers that the role of AI will be very telling in the war efforts and of course international nations as a whole. So as it is a particularly hot topic, do you have any predictions on how it will impact international and domestic politics in the future, and how misinformation and disinformation created by AI could help impact or hinder the war effort in Ukraine as it reaches 2 or 3 years on the forefront?
I think I probably come at it from a little bit of skepticism in the way that we tend to think of AI as primarily useful as a way to kind of present a digital representation of the battlefield, and one that can model what we're facing with some degree of predictability. And what I most worry about, I think, in that regard is, as you mentioned, kind of misinformation, in that we think we have reduced a very chaotic, complex arena that is filled with a lot of unpredictability and a lot of human decision making that is not always necessarily rational, that is not necessarily kind of modelable, if you will. I worry that relying too much on AI will instead lead countries to the incentive structure will shift from actually accomplishing a battlefield goal, taking, seizing, holding territory, to simply perfecting that kind of model building in the digital space. And I think we're highly incentivized to kind of lean into technology to help us model that space. But as I said before, that we sometimes lose sight of, well, what's the end goal that you want that modeling to service? And is the data that you've collected both A, representative of the war that you're trying to fight, and B, is it predictable enough that it's going to get you to that end goal, or is merely creating a better model the end goal in and of itself? And so I think kind of asking ourselves hard questions about what is AI intended to do in service of the human political, geopolitical, geographical goals of warfare, or is it merely to try and perfect that model? Those are both maybe worthy aspirations, but one may be probably more decisive in helping us kind of win wars or prevent them in the future. The other, I think, has a lot more of a market incentive but has less of a kind of discernible end goal attached to it.
I just want to quickly put in a plug for a piece Gavin wrote for Binding Hook, which is a media outlet that I'm one of the editors of. I had the pleasure of editing his piece on Claude Shannon's work as one of the founders of information theory. And I did not know much about Claude Shannon until Gavin introduced me to the subject. But one of the great things about some of sort of the forefathers myth busting that happens around the creators of some of these technologies, right? Claude Shannon's work has been seminal in what we're seeing now in large language models and AI moving forward. But he was incredibly skeptical of its use beyond a tool. That it was starting to build frameworks and actually drive kind of the questions we're asking, as opposed to being a tool that we use to actually get at some of the answers that we want. And I think we see that a lot in AI and technology in general, right? That we sort of can drift towards what the tools are good for, and then all of a sudden we're looking at those questions, as opposed to thinking more broadly about what actually we're trying to achieve, as Gavin said, and then using the tools that we have at hand to get there. Anyways, everyone should read the piece. It's great.
So speaking more broadly, a big theme both in your piece and across the issue of the SAIS review out this spring is the growing role of non-state actors in responding to global challenges and assuming the traditional responsibilities of government, such as the role of civil society in climate protection efforts or in private tech firms support for Ukraine, which you discussed. So what are the factors do you think are driving this trend, and how do you think they'll impact the Ukrainian government's ability to work with other actors such as the US and its allies, and overall come to the conclusion of continuing to their war effort against Russia?
I think just drawing on probably one of the themes in our paper is that traditionally the government or states have been kind of the intermediaries between the demands of the battlefield and kind of turning around and saying to their industrial base, hey, for us or for our allies and partners, we need you to make X, Y, or Z widgets. And the reason they had the awareness and the ability to kind of survey the scene and levy those demand signals is because they or the militaries themselves had this kind of frontline visibility of how things are going. That's really flipped, particularly with this war, in that insofar as states consider cyberspace to be a front of the battle or kind of an extension of the conventional war, states don't or militaries don't necessarily have the visibility at this point that the private sector does. And so in a major way, the private sector is kind of acting as both the foremost kind of intelligence gathering entity, and states are kind of relegated to a backseat. As Taylor said, for instance, US Cyber Command is only going to be able to go do a hunt forward operation in a third country at the invitation of that country. And they're probably only going to be parked on networks that are kind of foremost importance, the government, the critical infrastructure. But from a broader perspective, the Ukraine's cyber battle space, as it were, at this point, private sector, private entities, Microsoft, Mandiant's, CrowdStrike's, all of those, they have kind of the front row seat, and the government kind of has to accept that they're not describing the battle space anymore from a position of power or primacy, and B, kind of understanding what the needs are to reinforce that space is going to be something where they can play more an auxiliary role or a supporting role. But for instance, in late 2021, early 2022, if the US government tried to convene a committee to try to figure out how to render cyber support or technological support to Ukraine, they probably would have gotten in the way and slowed down that support than what actually happened, which was, a lot of companies going in of their own initiative. The cyber defense, the CDAC, Cyber Defense and Assistance Collective, kind of had already pre-baked in commercial relationships with folks in Ukraine where they could kind of pick up the phone and go, hey, I need X, Y, or Z now. Government committees would have probably gotten in the way of that. We kind of contrast that with World War I and World War II, where look, the White House, the War Industries Board, those guys had to kind of harmonize all these demand signals and turn around to willing and capable industrial players in the US to say, either stop making this, make that, or make more of X, not Y. And that process was extremely messy, as Taylor can attest from her research. It's never easy when the US tries to play a steering role in how industry works, particularly during wartime.
Yeah, I would just add, I agree with everything Gavin said, and I think that's something that came across in our paper. I do think that, the sort of mastering public-private partnerships is a very tricky business. It has been since the dawn of states, et cetera. And the World War I and World War II examples that we look at, again, a lot of was ad hoc and voluntary in ways that I think initially don't come across. That being said, and I completely agree that when you look at the Ukraine case, if government had tried to do too much too early, that would have probably been an impediment. At the same time, at this particular moment, you see a real overlapping of incentives that makes these ad hoc voluntary mechanisms incredibly efficient and effective. And I don't know if that'll be the case if this war drags on for the next several years. And there are also other potential conflict situations where those incentives won't align quite as well. And that is, I think, where governments still need to play a really key role in creating good incentive structures to galvanize industry. Knowing when to sort of step in and create those mechanisms versus letting things happen organically is important. It's a balancing act. I don't know if we've ever gotten it right, but sometimes it happens okay. And good, perfect is the enemy of the good. But again, I think there's a lot more work and research to be done on sort of what worked well, what could work better, and also how to get that right in the future if those incentives are just completely misaligned.
Sort of building off that, from your perspective, do you have an idea on how that public-private partnership can be best utilized to assist Ukraine? Is it a situation-to-situation basis, or is there a fundamental foundation that can be created in order to maximize the strengths of the private and the strength of the public in the war effort.
So I think we make the case in the paper, and I think it's worth kind of exploring a little bit more than we have, of like, there's a natural market incentive for a lot of what happened in Ukraine and what will probably happen irrespective of where on the globe conflict strikes. That market incentive is this, particularly for cybersecurity and technology companies: more users equal more sensors. More sensors equals better insight. Better insight equals more customers, because you can market that insight. More customers equal more sensors. So there's like this self-reinforcing kind of momentum that awareness in cyberspace, awareness via your technological base, that market incentive exists, and companies are going to chase that. And that's a good thing. And that also means governments should try to find ways to lean into that, so that they can economize time, attention, and money. There's no use trying to recreate a market incentive by committee, by bureaucracy. Better to just lean into one that already exists. But a great example is like January 2022, Amazon Web Services altruistically, voluntarily, patriotically says, we need to get in there into Ukraine. We need to make sure that all of the data that makes a state, land records, tax records, education records, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Like, we're going to bring in a bunch of snowballs, which are essentially like cooler sized memory sticks. And we're going to basically upload everything that makes Ukraine a state. We're going to go put that on the cloud. That was fantastic. That was proactive. No one in the government had to kind of beg them to go do that. And the reason being is, yes, they wanted to support Ukraine, and yes, it was the right thing to do. But also, yes, in an era where these companies have a market incentive to demonstrate the safety and the security of operating from the cloud, of course, there's an opportunity there, and they're going to lean into that. And so I think identifying where that momentum already exists and either clearing the brush out of the way for that to organically happen, or kind of augmenting it with more funding or backstopping or even personnel, if you will. For instance, just this past week or so, Ambassador Nate Fick, he's now been outfitted through Congress with $50 million of cybersecurity and digital assistance that he's got to figure out how to dole out. Is that, where do we spend that? Do we spend that on proactive resilience? Do we spend that on crisis recovery? Do we spend that on subsea cables? Those are hard questions he's got to ask. But I think one of the major things that you probably won't have to lose too much stress over is where there's already a market incentive. How do you just allow companies to lean into that? And I think that's a major thing that we wanted to highlight.
Yeah, and I'll just add, another piece is, again, making sure there's a real balance in terms of the size of public-private partnerships. And you hear this again and again, right? That trust is very, very hard to scale. And so some of these organic mechanisms evolve because people know each other, because people trust each other, because people worked together before. And again, that's not something technology can fix. That's a people issue. And you see this a lot in incident response issues. And FIRST is a great example, when they were expanding of trying to kind of balance how big should we make this umbrella so that we can be trustworthy in cyber incident response, but also inclusive. And so I think that's also where PPPs, there's no perfect model, and letting them kind of, again, crop up, flourish, grow, and also then maybe in some cases really stay small, agile, and very sort of distinct in their approach. It might be the best solution.
So you mentioned the altruism of Amazon or Apple, I apologize, and going and aiding Ukraine with maintaining their files and maintaining everything that makes the state on the cloud. So private companies typically are not bound by the same limitations that public organizations are, like states are. Can you speak to any issues you can see arising from those lack of legal limitations and the lack of scrutiny by the international community, and how those can be countered by states and governments while they're working with private corporations going forward?
So I think one of the major ones, and we were just talking beforehand, how there's some eerie similarities in where we are now and where kind of post World War I. One of the major things that there's a quote that we hit on in our paper of all of this industrial kind of galvanization in World War I to aid and support first our allies and then ourselves when we entered the war, kind of derailed a lot of the momentum within the US government to demonopolize and break up some of these major industrial powerhouses. And of course that worked to their advantage. And but we're in a similar spot now where, the FCC Chair Lena Khan has kind of made it her legacy project right now to really start to look hard at antitrust in the United States and look hard at how much dependency and resilience we perhaps gamble away by having 2, 3, 4 major power players upon which not only the US government is dependent, but upon which we, the global user base are kind of dependent upon. And so there's a real difficult balance to strike. On one hand, it's to our geopolitical advantage to lean into that preponderance of largely US-based or Western-based multinationals. On the other hand, as we've seen certainly with some of the vulnerabilities with a lot of and intrusions into Microsoft the last year, 2+, it creates vulnerabilities, and those dependencies are also something we need to hedge against. And as Lena Khan kind of says, our resilience needs to also be looked at in terms of the variety and the amount of competition that we have in these spaces. So I think going forward, that's going to be a tough discussion to have about how much we want to lean into these major industrial powerhouses and how much we need to think about antitrust as a tool.
Yeah, and I think one of the other points that we were talking about right before it started was some of the shifts that have happened around the role of the individual and the role of the individual between, in the state and also now companies. And when you look at cyber in particular, the security guarantees are coming from the state in some cases, but a lot of times they're coming from private corporations, which is where that monopoly power becomes very tricky and very dangerous. And it's harder to, again, as you said, there's some things that governments can still impose on companies, but it's harder for individual citizens to really demand, secure by design is the sort of security features that we need in order to have better products that are going to secure us in the long term. That wasn't the case in World War I and World War II, right? The relationship between citizens and industry was industry created in World War II 18.7 million new jobs. And so there was labor and capital, and people were employed, and people got their security from the government. And so that shift, I think, is where, again, going back to public-private partnerships, going back to the really important role of the state in figuring out how to balance those really tricky relationships that are shifting. Again, you have customers, but are also, again, looking for services from multiple avenues now in ways that weren't the case before.
Thank you so much. So thank you to both of you for coming and speaking with us today. I think we can now open it up to audience questions. So if anyone has any questions for our panelists, please.
So my question to you, Professor, building on the first point you made about the role of human element versus technology. And my question is, to what extent are we overstating the role of technology? In the sense that in any war, you still need to have an ultimate political objective, then you have a strategy to use your resources to achieve that objective, then you have tactics and operations. It could be argued that technology is mainly helping you to achieve some tactical and operational objective, but it wouldn't tell you what's the ultimate objective or tell you what your strategy should be. So are we here overstating a little bit technology, or what's your take on that?
So I think we tend to, particularly when it comes to war, I think we overstate technology's role in two ways. One, technology has long offered us the allure of, can I make war less bloody and less costly? Like, build me tools that make it less bloody and less costly. The hard truth is, though, war is bloody and it's costly. And often those detours that we take and the technologies we build, they can not only distract us from the fact, but almost help us avoid very hard and very necessary decisions about what is worth expending blood and treasure for. And so that's a very extreme way. Number two, which I think a lot of, there's been some great books, certainly since World War I, written about technology is something we look at to make us more efficient, to save time and money and labor. But efficient not only doesn't always equate to more impactful, efficient sometimes means less impactful. Like, so those efficiencies that we go searching for sometimes work at cross purposes, as we said, with what's the actual objective you're trying to reach. And so I think that allure of efficiency and that allure of economizing, whether it's blood, treasure, time, labor, I think those are sometimes as distractive and almost kind of a distractive in the sense of like opportunity costs that we might miss by focusing elsewhere, but also in terms of holding ourselves and our leaders to account for really hard decisions that they need to make about, is this war something that's worth fighting? Because if you're not willing to dedicate what in the end it always takes to win a war, blood, treasure, property, destruction, that's unavoidable. So I think technology sometimes is our easy button, so to speak, not just on the battlefield, but kind of politically as well.
I'll speak up. So when we talk about domains, like the air domain, the sea domain, and land domain, or we talk about like offensive and defensive, lineage or capabilities. In the cyberspace domain, is this a more offensive kind of domain, or is this a more defensive kind of domain? And how does that where do states want to put the money when it comes to either bulking up their defense or investing heavily in their offense? So I'm just curious on what the cyberspace domain is when it comes to offensive and defensive capabilities.
So really interesting question, and one that people still debate, right? You have sort of the persistent engagement folks who are very focused on, the way to be defensive is to basically be more offensive, to be forward leaning. You also, I think, have and I think in the earlier days of sort of cybersecurity policy work, there was a big, push towards, okay, it's all offensive, right? There's only so much defense you can do. Let's be destructive. Let's go forward. You can't defend on all fronts. I think that's shifting. I think there's a lot more people who really are taking a look at actually, no, there's much more of a balance here. And I would put myself in that camp as well. I think, there's a lot of focus on things like 0 days that, are right, unpreventable, catastrophic, right there. No one had a patch for them. And really sophisticated cyber attacks like Stuxnet or the incidents, the Ukrainian power grid hacks in 2016. They're super interesting to study. I encourage you all to do so. But they're also not the norm of what's happening. And there is so much that can be done defensively in terms of building resilience, building awareness, especially, as you take a step back from kind of the military sphere and just think about some of the civilian instruments. There's just a lot that we can still do. And so I think, you know, we aren't hearing as much about some of that because a lot of it gets from cyber hygiene that just isn't as fancy or interesting. But there's still so much that, you know, again, I've been in the ransomware world for the last month, so that's all I'm thinking about. But there's still so much that can be done to protect and really sort of stave off kind of a lot. There's still a lot of very run-of-the-mill stuff happening that's preventable. You know, if and I think also, you know, some of the work like the U.S. Hunt Forward team, et cetera, are also showing that even in the military space, right, there is a lot of sort of defending that we can still be doing. So I think the offensive leaning folks are maybe getting a bit more pushback than they were 5 or 10 years ago. Gavin, I'll hint.
I would foot stomp everything Taylor just said, and I would add, I think so much of the push for the offensive dominance of cyberspace is a little bit of a reaction to the fact that unlike all of the domains you listed, air, land, sea, this one, cyberspace, and certainly when you extend cyberspace into cognitive space, these don't obey the laws of physics. So much of the offensive kind of instinct, I think, stems from frustration or physics envy, if you will. Because you want, if you're a general, you want to know that if I aim a cannon that way, I know I can shoot my way through that wall, et cetera, et cetera. I have an understanding of a model, a mental model, because physics is constant. Cyberspace doesn't work that way. Human cognition doesn't work that way. It's not very well modelable. It's not, you don't know what the response is going to look like. You also have so much less of so much more of an unknown margin. And so I think a lot of our natural inclination to think, well, if I just fight my way through this, like I'll always have the advantage. Oh, maybe, but also maybe I think there's a degree to which we just need to grapple with the fact that domain probably isn't the right way to look at this, even though that's kind of the lot that we've cast militarily. We want to think of the information domain. But unfortunately, it just does not obey the laws of physics the way the other domains work. And that creates so much more ambiguity around what's possible.
Time for 1 or 2 more questions. Yes.
Thank you both for this fantastic discussion. I'm very much looking forward to reading the paper. I want to kind of push you guys on a question that I think occupies a lot of the brain space in this room and a lot of the brain space in many capitals around the world, which is how many of the lessons that we're learning in Ukraine are transferable outside of Ukraine? So how much of this is just unique circumstances in Ukraine versus unique circumstances that would generalize much more broadly? And there's a lot of reason to think that some of these are very Ukraine specific, right? So we talked a lot about private industry coming in. A lot of that is global industry, and they have massive markets and headquarters outside the conflict zone. So they've got a lot of stability, and then they're coming in and sort of removing information. Snowballs work if you can take them out of a conflict zone versus if you're just sort of like driving wildly across the United States, dodging munitions, little less sort of practical in that sense. You have a very contained conflict zone, both on the offense and the defense. And it is one of the least controversial, I think, conflicts globally for a large number of people in the United States, but globally, but also for industry. Most of these companies had no business in Russia to begin with. So there's a lot of reasons why some of these things might not travel much more broadly. Can you give us an example of something that you're like, do not learn this lesson, it will not travel, and something else you're like, no, this lesson, this is the very travel lesson. Please pick this one if you're looking to say lessons learned from sort of defense in Ukraine.
I think you are absolutely right that there are a broad swath of things in this conflict that simply do not port to other ones. Taiwan, I know, always looms large, and I'm by no means an expert on that region of the world, but I couldn't agree more. There's not very much that you can say about this conflict, particularly in terms of technological and cyber support, that would necessarily be portable to that kind of scenario. Again, geography, a whole lot of transatlantic history and heft kind of rolling behind it, et cetera. One thing I would offer, and I've written a little bit about this, that I do think is probably portable or at least warrants a little bit more skepticism post-Ukraine is the idea of what I would call the counter value cyber attack kind of theory that kind of builds on kind of the strategic air campaign theories of previous decades of if we just use this tool to make life inhospitable or to immiserate the civilian population, sooner or later they'll capitulate. Maybe. But also maybe you're expending an awful lot of that very limited technological sophistication, a lot of that very limited personnel expertise and personnel power to do what are very sophisticated cyber operations designed to turn the lights out, to shut your phone off, to deny you access to the internet, to make sure the trains don't run on time. Like all of those are definitely pesky and are going to make people very upset. There's a lot of magic between that disruption and a society saying, okay, we give up, please invade us and take over our state. And I think it's been historically very useful for generals and political leaders to talk themselves in to this idea that if I just make it pesky enough for them, I'll grind them down. And war after war, we see that like the anxiety and fear that you're trying to induce in that population doesn't usually result. What results is a lot more anger and resentment. And in the worst case scenario for the attacker, whether it's us or anyone else, is that they galvanize and rally around their flag. Now, again, that doesn't work as well for kinetic bombs. Like if you're bombing people into submission, yeah, sometimes that's going to work. At least in cyberspace, and from what I can tell from Ukraine's experience, what might be a portable lesson is that counting on cyber operations to kind of demoralize a population might not be a winning bet. And the opportunity costs of all of that technological sophistication, all that know-how, might just be a lot of wasted effort that you could have used elsewhere.
Yeah, I think it's a really great question. A couple of thoughts, and definitely agree with everything Gavin said. I think just two quick things that I would push back on in framing your question about sort of uncontroversial that this war has been. First of all, I think a lot of companies actually had major businesses in Russia, and some of the cybersecurity firms, not the major players and not sort of the monopoly players that we're talking about, but there were major financial repercussions for some organizations. And so I think there you see that there were kind of some altruistic kind of rallying around a flag effect. Also, in terms of support, I think support in the West has been quite unified, but if you look at the global South or outside of the West, there's quite a few countries that are not on the same page, that have abstained in the UN on voting on these issues, that don't really, are not placing a dog in the fight. And I think we're likely to see that in other situations as well. So I think, some of those narratives are a little bit more complicated, and just will definitely be something that folks like us will love to unpack for the next couple of years. In terms of lessons that I think we definitely can take away, I think there was a lot of early discussions right in the winter and summer of 2022 of sort of, okay, we're seeing the absolute limits of cyber operations, right? They don't work. That's why we're seeing land invasion. And I think what we're really seeing is some of the limits of domain thinking, as we talked about before. That thinking of cyberspace as, right, the fifth domain, or I'm losing count now, we've got space and a couple of others. And thinking of it as purely separate as something we can do without integrating it into everything else we're doing. That's a lesson we definitely need to take forward, because I think, like Gavin said, right, you're not going to annoy populations through cyberspace. You can't occupy territory, physical territory, through cyber attack. But there's a lot of things that cyber can do in conjunction with the other domains. Carrying something into domain thinking, in conjunction with other operations to make it more effective. So I think that's a big lesson to take away. And I think the other one is just something Gavin was saying earlier about, war always being about blood and treasure, and always being incredibly costly. I think that's a big lesson that we need to remember. a lot, I think a lot of us didn't have on our bingo cards for the last couple of years, right? Seeing the return of just really brutal land warfare tactics. We kind of have thought, especially in the US, that technology has solved our way out of those things. And the costs of war are always incredibly high. And we're not going to, again, sort of cyber our way out of this or, whatever, or AI our way out of this future.
That is a fantastic stopping point. Well, thank you both to our panelists for fantastic insight. I encourage everyone to both read their piece when it is published in a week or so and look into their other works that we had mentioned today. To our audience, thank you all so much for coming. Please feel free to grab lunch. You're encouraged to take as much as you would like. And thank you to everyone for joining us today.